Thank you for speaking with me, Professor Bloom. Could you begin by saying what minarets are and what made you interested in their history?
A minaret is a tall tower that's attached to a mosque, and supposedly it's designed for the call to prayer, for the muezzin, who's the person who goes up to the top of it and says 5 times a day, Allahu Akbar, and come to prayer, etc. I got interested in them because I realized that some mosques had minarets and other mosques didn't, and I wondered if it was such an essential feature of a mosque, why didn't they all have minarets? I was working on a totally unrelated problem and sort of stumbled upon this quite by accident, and I sort of put it aside, and it sort of festered in my brain. And then I started working more and more on this, and eventually published a book in 1989 on it. And this book is the second version of that book.
How did you first come to this topic?
Well, I was actually working on my dissertation, and I was studying the art and architecture in North Africa, in what's now Tunisia. And I noticed that there were 2 mosques that were built very much near each other, 50 miles apart, and maybe 50 years different in time. And one was clearly a copy of the other one. And the first one had a very big minaret, and the second one didn't have a minaret and had a big doorway instead of the minaret. And this was the original idea that just got me thinking about this. Why would, if the second people copied the first mosque in every respect, why wouldn't they have copied the minaret? And so I deduced that it must have some sort of meaning that meant that the second people wouldn't have wanted to build one. So that got me very interested in the idea.
Why do some mosques have minarets and others don't?
Basically, the minaret was not present. Everyone accepts that the minarets were not part of the earliest mosques. And according to the Prophet Muhammad, people should give the call to prayer from the doorway. It was traditional to give the call to prayer from the doorway or the roof of the mosque, which was a place where people would gather. And you would do this 5 times a day before, to bring people to the mosque for worship, for communal worship. And then a second call to prayer would be given inside the mosque once people had gathered in the mosque. And that was the situation for many, many years. Eventually, people built little shelters on the roofs of mosques to shelter the guy who was giving the call to prayer, because it might be very sunny or it could be rainy or whatever. So they were little boxes up on the roof. And what I found was that these little boxes on the roofs of mosques soon got conflated or combined with towers, which were built for entirely different purposes, and which were added to mosques. And people sort of said, oh, well, this is like that, so we'll just use one for the other.
I see that you published a book in 1989 called Minaret, the Symbol of Islam. How is your new book, The Minaret, differs from the old one?
Well, the the old book was published in a very small edition by an obscure branch of Oxford University Press. And it sold out, which was remarkable, but it was impossible to republish it. And it sort of got, sort of forgotten, I guess, though people kept asking me for, how do I get a copy? And sometimes I would see copies on the used book market that went for vast amounts of money. So that got me sort of interested in thinking about doing a new edition. And so I thought about it and decided to do this new edition, and then realized I thought it was going to be a simple, easy job to just rewrite it and update it. But it turned out to be far more complicated than I had imagined. First of all, because I grew a lot in the last 30, 40 years, and my opinions have changed, and my style of writing has changed. And in the old days, I thought that it was acceptable or even preferable to make things look scholarly. And so therefore it meant difficult, and you had to transcribe all sorts of Arabic words with funny little characters and things like that. And I realized over the years that just made it more difficult for people to understand what I was actually talking about. And so one change I made was to simplify the whole book a lot and take out a lot of transcription from Arabic and just use more common words, to change the double dating system, because Muslims follow a calendar that begins in 622 when the Prophet emigrated from Mecca to Medina. And so you have different dating system. And in the first edition, I had these two systems, and I realized it was just crazy to use this, because it didn't really help matters. It didn't help people understand things. So those were kind of practical changes. But then I made it. I had sort of stopped my book sort of halfway along the story around the year 1300 or something, and because I sort of ran out of steam. And I thought I'd leave. I didn't really know much about the later period. And so I sort of left it with a sort of breathless summary of what would happen in later years. But I realized in the intervening years, nobody else picked up the ball and wrote about or very few people had written about what happened in the later period. And it was unfair and wrong to sort of imply that things had stopped developing in, say, 1300. So what I did was I continued the story, and that was a lot of work, because you're dealing with a world now that stretches from the Atlantic coast of Africa to the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. So I had my work cut out for me. So I added a whole lot about the later period and a much broader expansion.
Why do minarets look so different in different places?
That's a good question. In Islamic architecture, all mosques, or virtually all mosques, have a mihrab, which is a niche, an arch-shaped opening or semicircular opening in the Mecca-facing wall of the mosque. And basically, they look pretty much the same. They're all about the same size and stuff, from east to west, north to south, early to late. They're relatively the same. But that's not the case for minarets. And so, one of the reasons is because they were introduced later, and that there was no specific form that they had to take, because people use their own tower traditions. And so there were tower traditions, let's say, in the Mediterranean world that were different from the tower traditions in the Iranian world. And so as they developed later, they all developed separately. And it's only in the 20th and 21st centuries, where, with the proliferation of images and electronic media and people going on the pilgrimage, that there's a kind of homogenization, so that you now see that in China, for example, that whereas they traditionally didn't have minarets, now mosques are built in a kind of generic Islamic style with big green domes and tall, pointy minarets.
Why is your topic relevant today?
Well, I always thought it was something that happened deep in the past, but it turns out that minarets are with us. I don't know if you remember that in Switzerland about 5 years ago, there was this minaret controversy where the Swiss voted overwhelmingly to ban the construction of minarets in Switzerland, and there was a huge campaign, largely racist, I think, against Muslims who were perceived as being foreigners. And they were actually, in my book, I have a reproduction of the poster that was used, which shows a woman in a chador up against a Swiss flag with minarets coming out of the Swiss flag as if they were missiles. And the implication is somehow that if minarets are allowed to be built in Switzerland, then Heidi is going to be wearing a chador instead of a dirndl. And so, it was very much in the news. But it's not just in Switzerland. It happened in Britain, at Oxford, where the Islamic Center wanted to build a minaret and were told that it was too high, and so they had to build a short and stubby one because it was going to destroy the skyline, the traditional skyline of Oxford. And it's also happened in the United States in several towns, and I even got called by a lawyer once where the local Islamic community wants to build a mosque, and they're told that building a mosque is fine, but they can't have a minaret because it goes against zoning regulations. So it's with us, and I thought that I realized that my book would give some background, some historical background to all this.
Does the minaret have any relationship to the skyscraper?
This was an interesting question, or is an interesting question, because I realized that the minarets were built throughout the Muslim world as signs of Islam, and that they were supposed to represent the power and might of Islam because they were big and tall structures in an otherwise relatively flat architectural landscape. And now the tallest building in the world is the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, which is taller than the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building combined. And it's claimed that its design is based on Islamic principles of design and such things, but it really is a monument to commerce and consumerism and stuff like this. And I thought that it's really interesting to see how the world has changed and how in earlier centuries people vied to build, rulers vied to build these extraordinary tall structures to show off their power. Like in this remote Afghan valley, there was a story this last week about the Minaret of Jam, which is in this remote valley in Afghanistan, which is in danger of falling over. But the problem is it's very difficult for people to get there safely. But this was this obscure ruler spent his energy building this. Today, they spend their energy building skyscrapers.